The smell hit Greta Hoffmann before the sound did, a scent so foreign, so impossibly rich, that for a moment she thought she'd been transported to some fever dream manufactured by her starving mind. It wasn't the smell of turnip soup or black bread or the bitter ersatz coffee that had sustained her through the final collapse of Berlin. It was something golden, something that crackled and hissed, something that made saliva flood her mouth so suddenly she had to swallow hard to keep from embarrassing herself in front of the American soldiers. The truck had stopped 20 minutes ago. Through the canvas flaps, Greta could see dust motes dancing in the Arkansas sunlight, a light somehow different from German light, broader and more relentless, pressing down on everything with democratic indifference. She sat wedged between Margarita Schultz, whose left hand was still bandaged from the bombing that had killed her 2 children, and young Annalise Fisher, barely 19, who hadn't spoken a complete sentence since they'd been processed at the port in New York 3 weeks prior. There were 47 of them in total. 47 women who had been something else before: nurses, telegraph operators, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, administrative clerks for the Wehrmacht. Now they were simply prisoners, enemies of the state they found themselves in, displaced persons wearing the same gray uniforms that had been issued to them in Le Havre, their heads still spinning from the Atlantic crossing that had taken them so impossibly far from everything they'd ever known. "Fascistas," Margarita whispered, her nose wrinkling as another wave of that impossible smell rolled through the truck. "It's like fat, cooking fat, but different." Greta pressed her face closer to the gap in the canvas. The compound stretched before them, rows of wooden barracks painted white, a water tower rising like a sentinel against the impossibly blue sky, and in the center a building larger than the others with smoke rising from a chimney despite the June heat. Women in the same gray uniforms were walking between buildings, some carrying buckets, others just standing in small groups, their faces turned toward the truck with an expression Greta couldn't quite read. Curiosity? Wariness? Hope? An American sergeant appeared at the back of the truck, his face red from the heat, his uniform crisp despite the temperature. He was young, younger than Greta's brother Helmut had been when the telegram came. And when he spoke, his German was clumsy but earnest, delivered with the broad vowels of someone who had learned the language from a textbook rather than a mother's lips. "Welcome to Camp Joseph T. Robinson. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will work, you will be fed, you will be housed. Any questions will be answered by Commandant Morrison after you are processed. Please exit the vehicle in an orderly manner." The women moved slowly, cramped legs protesting, joints stiff from hours of travel. Greta was the 7th to emerge, blinking against the brilliant sunlight that seemed to erase all shadows, all nuance. The heat was like a physical presence, pressing against her skin, making her gray uniform feel like a wool blanket in a sauna. But still that smell persisted, growing stronger as they were led in a ragged column toward the largest building. Annalise stumbled beside her, and Greta caught her elbow. The girl's eyes were glazed, unfocused, the same look Greta had seen on shell-shocked soldiers during the final months. "Easy," Greta murmured. "One foot, then another. We're still alive, Annalise. That means something." Did it? The question had haunted her since surrender, since the moment the Red Army had swept through their field hospital outside Königsberg and everything had become chaos. Blood and screaming, and the particular sound a human skull makes when it strikes concrete. She'd survived by being useful, by having medical training, by speaking enough Russian to say, "I am a nurse, I can help." But survival felt less like victory with each passing day, more like a sentence whose terms she didn't yet understand. The processing building's interior was cooler, blessed with shade and a movement of air from oscillating fans that clicked rhythmically as they swept back and forth. Tables had been set up in rows, each manned by American soldiers, some men, some women, all with that same expression of bureaucratic efficiency mixed with something else. Not quite sympathy, not quite curiosity, something in between, as if they weren't sure what to make of these German women, these former enemies who looked like scarecrows more than soldiers. Name? The woman at the first table had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. Her German was better than the sergeant's, touched with a Bavarian accent that made Greta's throat tighten unexpectedly. Hoffmann, Greta Hoffmann, born Dusseldorf, 1920. Occupation before? Nurse, surgical nurse at Charité Hospital in Berlin, then field hospitals in Poland and East Prussia. The woman, her nameplate read L.T. Morrison, which meant she was related to the commandant, wrote carefully, her pen scratching across the form with mechanical precision. Any specialized skills? Languages? Some English, some Russian. I can set bones, suture wounds, assist in surgery, manage ward administration. The list felt hollow, a catalog of talents that had been used to patch up young men so they could go back to the front and die more efficiently. Automotive repair. Lieutenant Morrison's eyebrow raised fractionally.
My father owned a garage. He taught me before everything. Before the uniforms and the speeches and the flags everywhere. Before the world had gone mad with certainty. Before the war. You'll be assigned to Barracks 7. Medical personnel are housed together. You'll work in the infirmary here unless we need you elsewhere. Lieutenant Morrison stamped the form with decisive finality. Next table for clothing issue. You'll receive 2 additional uniforms, undergarments, and work boots. Meals are communal, 3 times daily. Breakfast at 600, lunch at 1200, dinner at 1800. Any violations of camp rules will result in loss of privileges. Any questions? 1,000 questions crowded Greta's mind, but she shook her head. What could she ask that would matter? Where is home now? When can we go back? Will Germany even exist when this is over? The questions were too large, too frightening, and this woman with her forms and her stamps was not the person who could answer them. The clothing issue went quickly. The uniforms were the same gray but cleaner than what they'd been wearing, and the undergarments were made of cotton so soft that Marguerite actually gasped when she touched them. The boots were worn but sturdy, American military issue that someone had carefully resold. Small mercies, Greta thought, remembering the newspaper-stuffed shoes that had been her last footwear in Berlin. And then they were led to the dining hall. The building was large enough to hold perhaps 200 people, with long tables arranged in neat rows and benches bolted to the floor. Windows ran along both sides, propped open to catch whatever breeze existed, and the oscillating fans here were larger, moving air with steady determination. But it was the smell that stopped Greta in her tracks, that made every woman in our group freeze as if they'd encountered an invisible wall. It was the smell from the truck, magnified 100-fold, rich and savory and impossibly complex, a symphony of scents that spoke of abundance, of fat and salt and something else, spices, herbs, that made Greta's stomach clench with sudden, violent hunger. She hadn't felt real hunger in months, had become so accustomed to the gnawing emptiness that it had become a constant companion, easy to ignore. But this smell made hunger roar back to life with savage intensity. "Holy Mother of God," Marguerite breathed in dialect, her hand clutching Greta's arm. "What is that?" American soldiers were moving between the tables, carrying large metal trays. And on those trays, Greta's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Pieces of chicken, whole pieces, legs and breasts and wings, but they were covered in something golden brown and crispy, glistening with fat, steam rising from them in lazy spirals. Beside them, mounds of what looked like mashed potatoes, but whiter and fluffier than any potato she ever seen. And covering everything, pooling in the dips and valleys of the trays, was a thick, pale gravy that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. "Fried chicken," said a voice beside them. Greta turned to find an older woman, maybe 50, with a face carved by hardship but softened by something that might have been kindness. She wore the same gray uniform but with the armband that marked her as a barracks leader, someone who had been here long enough to learn the systems. "They call it Southern cooking, from the American South. We get it once a week, sometimes twice if the commandant is feeling generous. That's for us? Annelise's voice was barely a whisper, but it was the first time she had spoken voluntarily in weeks. The older woman smiled, and it transformed her face entirely, years falling away. That's for us. Come, sit. They'll show you how it works. They were directed to a table near the center where other women were already seated, women who looked less skeletal than Greta and her group, who had color in their cheeks and a certain steadiness in their movements that spoke of adequate nutrition and regular sleep. A young black woman in an American uniform approached their table, her smile professional but not unkind. "Afternoon, ladies. Name's Private Washington. I'll be serving your table today. We've got fried chicken, mashed potatoes with cream gravy, green beans with bacon, and biscuits. You'll each get one piece of chicken to start. We don't want anyone getting sick from too much rich food too fast. If you can handle it, you can come back for seconds." She gestured to the serving line at the far end of the hall. "Y'all ever had Southern cooking before?" Silence. Greta shook her head mutely, unable to form words. The tray that Private Washington set on their table held enough food to feed a family for a week in Berlin. No, enough food to feed a neighborhood. The chicken pieces were enormous, each one practically the size of her fist, and the gravy alone could have sustained half a dozen people. "All right, then." Private Washington seemed unoffended by their stunned silence. "Let me show you how it's done." She placed a plate in front of Greta, then used tongs to transfer a chicken leg onto it. The meat was so tender that the tongs left slight indentations in the crust. Then came a scoop of mashed potatoes with cream gravy, a ladle of gravy that Private Washington poured with practiced precision, a smaller scoop of green beans, and finally 2 biscuits that looked like clouds made solid.
"Gravy goes on everything," Private Washington explained, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had given this speech many times. "That's how we do it back home. And don't be shy about using your hands for the chicken. Nobody here is going to judge you for eating properly. You need anything else, you just raise your hand. Enjoy, ladies." Greta stared at her plate. The steam rising from it carried that incredible smell directly to her nose, and her hands trembled as she picked up her fork. Beside her, Margareta was crying silently, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and dripping onto the table. On her other side, Annelise just stared, her lips moving soundlessly as if in prayer. "Eat," said the older woman from before, now seated across from them. Her nameplate read Schmidt, a common name that could have belonged to half of Germany. "I know it seems like a trick. I know you're waiting for someone to snatch it away, but it's real. This is real. The Americans, they feed their prisoners. They feed us well. And once you accept that, once you truly believe it, everything else becomes a little bit easier to bear." Greta cut a small piece of chicken with her fork, watching as the golden crust yielded to reveal white meat beneath, juice running out to mix with the gravy. She brought it to her mouth slowly, half expecting it to vanish like morning mist. The taste exploded across her tongue, salt and pepper and something smoky, the crunch of the crust giving way to meat so tender it practically dissolved, fat and protein her body had been screaming for since the rations had started shrinking in 1943. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was 9 years old again, at her grandmother's table in the countryside near Cologne, eating sauerbraten and potato dumplings, while the radio played Schumann and the afternoon sun slanted through lace curtains. When she opened her eyes, she was back in Arkansas, in a prisoner of war camp, in a world that had been turned inside out. But the chicken was still there, still warm, still real. And despite everything, despite the uniforms and the wire fences, and the knowledge that home was an ocean away and possibly destroyed, despite all of that, Greta Hoffmann began to eat. Around her, the dining hall filled with sounds, the clink of forks on plates, the soft murmur of conversation in German, tentative at first, then growing stronger. Someone laughed, actually laughed, a sound so unexpected that several heads turned. Margareta was still crying, but she was also eating,
stuffing biscuit into her mouth with both hands like a child, gravy running down her chin. Annalise ate slowly, methodically, tears streaming down her face, each bite taken with reverent care. And the smell, that impossible, wonderful smell, filled everything, pushing back against the shadows that had taken up residence in Greta's chest since the day the Russians came, since the day she'd watched her hospital burn, since the day she'd surrendered to Americans in Bavaria and been told she was going to something called Arkansas to wait out her sentence. At the front of the hall, Commandant Morrison stood watching them, his face unreadable. He was a tall man, in his 50s, with gray hair and the upright posture of someone who spent decades in uniform. His eyes swept over the women with that same expression Greta had seen earlier, not quite sympathy, not quite curiosity, but something in between, something that might have been assessment, or might have been something more complicated, something that acknowledged the fundamental strangeness of this moment. German women, former enemies, being fed fried chicken in the American South while the world outside continued to tear itself apart and then slowly, painfully, begin knitting itself back together. Greta took another bite, and another, and with each bite she felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, because hope was still too dangerous, too presumptuous, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition that she was still alive, still capable of tasting food, still inhabiting a body that responded to nourishment with something other than despair. The question that had been forming since they'd arrived remained unspoken, but present in every face around her. What kind of enemy feeds you this well? What kind of captor gives you chicken and gravy and biscuits that melt on your tongue? And what did it mean about everything they'd been told, everything they'd believed, if the monsters turned out to serve dinner on clean plates with something that looked dangerously close to care? Greta didn't have answers. Not yet. But as she ate, as the chicken and gravy settled into her hollow stomach and her body began to remember what it felt like to be fed, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't expected to feel again. Curiosity about what came next. The first night in Barracks 7, Greta didn't sleep. She lay on her bunk, a real bunk, with a thin but clean mattress, a pillow that smelled of bleach and cotton, and a wool blanket that was rough but warm. She listened to the sounds of women processing their new reality. Margareta in the bunk below cried silently for hours, her shoulders shaking just enough that the frame vibrated. Across the narrow aisle, someone was praying in whispered Bavarian dialect, the words too soft to distinguish, but the rhythm unmistakable. Further down, someone was having a nightmare, German and Russian mixing in frightened mumbles until someone else hissed at her to be quiet. Through the window screens, Arkansas night sounds filtered in. Crickets and bullfrogs, and the distant hoot of an owl, a symphony so different from German nights that it might as well have been music from another planet. The air was thick and humid, pressing against Greta's skin like a warm, damp cloth, and even with all the windows open and the door propped for circulation, she felt like she was breathing through cotton. But what kept her awake wasn't the heat, or the sounds, or even the strangeness of being on the other side of the world. Was the chicken. Or rather, what the chicken represented. For 2 years, Greta had been operating on a simple equation. Survive the next hour, then the next, then the next. Don't think about Helmut or her parents or what Berlin looked like now. Don't think about the patients who had died because she'd run out of morphine, or the ones who had survived only to be shot in their beds when the Russians came through. Don't think about the smell of burning flesh, or the sound of bone saws, or the way blood looked black in candlelight when the generators failed. Just survive. Just keep moving. Just be useful enough that whoever was in charge found it more valuable to keep you alive than to kill you.
But the chicken had fractured that equation. The chicken implied something beyond mere survival. It suggested that there might be rules, systems, even a kind of decency operating in this strange new world. And if that was true, if the Americans really were going to treat them according to some code that included regular meals and clean beds and medical care, then Greta had to reckon with something she'd been avoiding: the future. What did the future mean for a German woman who had spent the war patching up soldiers? What did it mean for someone who had followed orders, who had worn the uniform, who had been, even in the small, technical way a nurse can be, complicit in all of it? The Americans called them prisoners of war, which implied that this was temporary, that someday they would go home. But home to what? To the rubble of Berlin? To a country divided between victors? To family graves that might not even have markers? Morning came with a bell that jangled loud enough to wake the dead. Women groaned and stirred, moving with the sluggish reluctance of people who had finally found something resembling rest. Greta swung her legs over the side of her bunk and dropped to the floor, her feet protesting the sudden weight. Margareta emerged from below, her face puffy and red but composed, her eyes meeting Greta's with a look that said, "We don't talk about the crying." "Breakfast," Margareta said flatly. "Think it'll be chicken again?" "Unlikely." Greta pulled on her uniform, one of the new ones, which fit better than the rags she'd been wearing, and ran her fingers through her hair. She needed a haircut, needed a lot of things, but let's find out. The morning routine was surprisingly regimented. Roll call at 0545, where Commandant Morrison himself stood at the front of the assembled women and read names from a clipboard, his pronunciation of German names careful, if not perfect. Then a march to the washing facilities. Actual sinks with running water, cold but clean, and soap that smelled of lye but lathered properly. Then the dining hall. Breakfast was not chicken, it was oatmeal. Thick and sweet with brown sugar, served with toast and margarine and cups of real coffee, weak American coffee, but hot and plentiful. There were scrambled eggs, too, and bacon, and for women who had subsisted on turnip soup and black bread for months, it was almost as shocking as the fried chicken had been. Greta ate mechanically, her mind already moving to what came next. After breakfast came work assignments. Lieutenant Morrison had said medical personnel would work in the infirmary, which meant she would be doing what she'd always done: assessing, treating, managing. The familiarity should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a weight settling back onto her shoulders, the weight of responsibility for bodies that could break in so many ways. The infirmary was a long, low building on the eastern edge of the compound, painted the same white as everything else, but with a red cross painted on the roof and on the door. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and cotton and something else. Bandages, maybe? Or the particular smell of a space dedicated to healing? There were 20 beds in 2 rows, most of them empty. At the far end, a separate room with a closed door. Surgery, Greta guessed, or examination. A woman in her 40s was waiting for them, 3 medical personnel from the new arrivals. She wore a white coat over her gray uniform, and her nameplate read Dr. Vogel, though whether that was her real name or an assigned one, Greta couldn't tell. Her face was thin and lined, but her eyes were sharp, assessing them with the rapid triage of someone who had learned to judge capability quickly. "Hoffmann, Braun, and Fischer," Dr. Vogel said, consulting a clipboard. "I'm told one of you is a surgical nurse, one is a general practitioner, and one is a trainee. Which is which?" "I'm the surgical nurse, Braun is the GP, Fischer is the trainee." Dr. Vogel nodded. "Good. We need all 3. This camp has nearly 400 women now, with more arriving weekly. We treat everything from minor cuts to surgical emergencies, though anything truly serious gets transferred to the American Military Hospital in Little Rock. We work alongside American medics. You'll meet Corporal Henderson and Private Jameson. They're good people. Treat them with respect, and they'll do the same." She paused, her gaze sharpening. "I won't ask where you served or what you saw. That's not relevant here. What's relevant is that these women, our women, need medical care, and we're going to provide it. Understood?" Understood. And she meant it. The work began immediately. A woman had cut her hand on broken glass while washing dishes. Another had developed an infected blister from her new boots. A third was running a fever, malaria, Dr. Vogel suspected, picked up somewhere during the long journey from Europe. Greta fell into the rhythm easily, her hands remembering what her mind wanted to forget: how to clean a wound, how to wrap a bandage, how to take a temperature and interpret what the body was saying through its fever and its pain. Corporal Henderson arrived mid-morning, a lanky man from Texas with a drawl so thick Greta had to concentrate to understand his English. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with sunburned skin and a face that looked like it smiled easily. When he saw the 3 new medical personnel, he nodded once, sharply, and said, "Y'all know what you're doing?" "Yes," Dr. Vogel said before Greta could respond. "They're qualified." "Good enough for me." Henderson set down a crate of supplies: bandages, iodine, aspirin, sulfa powder. "This is the weekly delivery. We're pretty well stocked, but if you need something special, put in a request and we'll see what we can do. No guarantees, but we try." The morning passed in a blur of small injuries and smaller conversations. Greta found herself talking to the women who came through, not about the war, never about the war, but about smaller things: where they were from, what they missed most, whether anyone had heard anything about mail, about letters home, about when they might see their families again. The answers were mostly variations of, "I don't know," but the asking seemed to matter, seemed to give the women something to hold on to. Lunch was soup and sandwiches, thick slices of bread with cheese and what Henderson called lunch meat, which tasted vaguely of ham but was too uniform to be anything natural. There were apples, too, crisp and sweet, and Greta ate hers slowly, savoring each bite, remembering how rare fruit had been in the final years. It was during afternoon clinic hours that Annalise Fisher broke down. They were treating a woman who had fainted during work detail. Simple dehydration combined with heat exhaustion, nothing serious. Greta had administered water and salt tablets and was explaining to the woman in quiet German that she needed to drink more frequently in this climate, that Arkansas heat wasn't like German heat, when she heard sobbing from the examination room. Dr. Vogel was already moving, but Greta was closer. She pushed through the door to find Annalise sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees, sobbing so hard her entire body shook. The examination table held bandages and scissors and a half-prepared suture kit, but whatever had triggered this breakdown wasn't visible. "Annalise?" Greta knelt beside her, not touching. Some people needed space when they shattered, and kept her voice low and steady. "What happened?" The girl couldn't speak, could only shake her head violently, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Dr. Vogel appeared in the doorway, took in the scene, and made a decision. "Give her 5 minutes, then get her to barracks 7. She's done for the day." But Greta didn't just want to send her away. She recognized this kind of breakdown, had seen it in soldiers, in nurses, in herself once or twice during the long nights when the wounded kept coming and coming, and there was never enough morphine, never enough time, never enough hope. "Annalise," she said again, more firmly, "look at me." Slowly, Annalise's head lifted. Her eyes were red and wild, her face blotchy with tears. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't pretend this is normal. I can't pretend that feeding us makes it okay. I can't. My mother is dead. My father is dead. My sister was in Dresden when she couldn't finish. Didn't need to. Dresden was a word that carried its own weight, its own horror." "I know," Greta said, though she didn't, not really. Her family might be alive, might be dead, she had no way of knowing. But she knew grief, knew the way it could lie dormant for weeks and then surge up without warning, drowning everything in its path. "Then, why are we here?" Annalise's voice was rising, hysteria creeping in at the edges. "Why are they feeding us chicken? Why are they being kind? We're the enemy. We're Germans. We're supposed to be what? Starved? Beaten? Shot?" Greta kept her voice level, clinical even, using the tone she'd used with shell-shocked soldiers. Would that make more sense? Would that make it easier? Annalise stared at her, and for a moment Greta thought she might scream. But then something shifted in the girl's face, some internal collapse that was almost visible. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anything anymore." "None of us do," Greta said, and this time she did reach out, placing a hand on Annalise's shoulder. "But we're alive, and for now, that has to be enough." It took 10 minutes to get Annalise calm enough to walk back to the barracks. Dr. Vogel prescribed rest and observation, clinical words for the simple truth that the girl was breaking and there was nothing medicine could do for that kind of wound. Greta walked her across the compound, through the afternoon heat that shimmered off the white buildings, and deposited her with Frau Schmidt, the barracks leader, who nodded grimly and promised to keep an eye on her.
Walking back to the infirmary, Greta found herself thinking about that question. Why are they feeding us chicken? It was the same question she'd been circling since yesterday, the same question that kept her awake. Because it wasn't just about food. It was about the implications of food, about what it meant when your enemy treated you better than your own side had in the final months. It was about cognitive dissonance and propaganda and the uncomfortable possibility that everything you'd been told might have been lies. The Americans weren't supposed to be kind. They were supposed to be gangsters and capitalists and mongrel race degenerates. That's what the posters had said, what the radio had broadcast, what every official source had insisted. But the Americans Greta had encountered so far were just people. Tired people doing a job, sometimes efficiently, sometimes with visible compassion. Corporal Henderson with his easy drawl and his weekly supply deliveries. Private Washington with her careful instructions on how to eat gravy. Lieutenant Morrison with her Bavarian accent and her patient form-filling. Even Commandant Morrison, standing at the front of the dining hall, watching them eat with that unreadable expression. What did it mean when the enemy was just people? That evening, after dinner, pork chops this time, with applesauce and green beans, Greta found herself sitting outside Barracks 7, watching the sun set over the compound. The sky was doing something extraordinary, painting itself in shades of orange and pink and purple that seemed too vivid to be real. Other women sat nearby, some talking quietly, others just watching, processing. Marguerite joined her, lowering herself onto the bench with a grunt. "You hear about the letter?" "What letter?" "Frau Schmidt says they're going to let us write home. 1 letter per month, censored, but still, letters." Marguerite's voice was carefully neutral, but Greta could hear the hope underneath, fragile and desperate. "I could write to my sister in Munich, if she's still alive, if Munich is still there." The enormity of it hit Greta like a physical blow. Letters. Communication with the world beyond the wire. The possibility of knowing whether her parents had survived, whether the apartment building in Dusseldorf still stood, whether anyone she'd ever known was still breathing. "When?" Greta's voice came out hoarse. "Starting next week. They're setting up a system. We write them here, they go through censors, then they get mailed through the Red Cross." Marguerite pulled at a thread on her uniform. "Do you have someone to write to?" Did she? Her parents, if they were alive. Her friend Erica, who had worked at the hospital before being transferred to Munich. Her cousin Friedrich, who had been stationed in Italy last she'd heard, but that was 1944 and Italy was a graveyard by then. The list of people who might still exist felt impossibly small, a handful of names against the vast darkness of might be dead. "Maybe," Greta said finally. "Yes, my parents." They sat in silence watching the sunset fade to twilight, watching the stars begin to appear. Different constellations here, or the same ones from a different angle, Greta wasn't sure. Somewhere in the compound, someone was singing, a German folk song about mountains and home, and the sound carried across the still evening air like something from a dream. Over the following days, Greta established a routine, because routine was how you survived anything. Wake at 05:30 before the bell, wash, dress, attend roll call. Breakfast in the dining hall, where the food continued to be abundant and varied. Oatmeal, eggs, bacon, toast, sometimes pancakes that swam in maple syrup, sometimes hash browns crispy with onions. Then work in the infirmary from 0800 to 1600, with an hour break for lunch. Evening free time until 2100, then lights out at 2200. The work in the infirmary was steady, but not overwhelming. Most cases were minor: cuts, bruises, blisters, heat exhaustion, the occasional sprained ankle from uneven ground. But there were harder cases too. A woman who had developed pneumonia and needed round-the-clock care, another who had been beaten by Soviet soldiers before her capture and whose ribs had healed incorrectly, leaving her in constant pain, a third who was pregnant, 5 months along, her belly just beginning to show, and terrified of what would happen when the baby came. Greta found herself drawn to these harder cases, the ones that required more than bandages and aspirin. She stayed late some nights, monitoring temperatures, adjusting medications, simply sitting with women who were too afraid or too alone to sleep. Dr. Vogel noticed, but said nothing, just occasionally brought her coffee, real coffee, stronger than the watery breakfast variety, and nodded approvingly. It was during one of these late nights that Greta met Ruth Goldstein. Ruth arrived in the infirmary at 2300, long after lights out, escorted by Frau Schmidt and looking like she was about to die. Her skin was gray, her breathing shallow and rapid, and when Greta peeled back her uniform shirt, she found an abdomen rigid with infection. Appendicitis, advanced, possibly already ruptured. "We need to operate," Greta said immediately. "Now." If we wait until morning, Dr. Vogel was already moving toward the surgery room, her face set in grim determination. "Henderson lives on base. Schmidt, wake him. Tell him we need an American surgeon here immediately. This is beyond our authorization."
But Greta was looking at Ruth's face, at the way her lips were turning blue, at the thready pulse jumping weakly in her neck. "There isn't time," she said quietly. "She'll be dead before he arrives." The silence that followed was weighted with implications. German prisoners operating on a German prisoner without American supervision. The potential for blame if things went wrong. The violation of whatever protocols governed this strange arrangement. But Dr. Vogel had been a surgeon once, before the war had turned everyone into something else, and she recognized the calculus of life and death. "Frau Schmidt, wake Henderson anyway. Tell him we're proceeding with emergency surgery. Hoffmann, scrub, I'll need you to assist." Dr. Vogel was already stripping off her coat, moving with the decisive speed of someone who had made impossible choices before, and pray the Americans understand necessity. The surgery room was small but well-equipped, better equipped than the field hospital where Greta had spent the final months of the war. There was proper lighting, proper instruments, proper anesthesia. Dr. Vogel worked with practiced efficiency, her hands steady as she made the incision, as she navigated through layers of tissue gone angry and inflamed. The appendix had indeed ruptured, spilling poison into Ruth's abdomen, and for 45 minutes the two women worked in near silence, cleaning, cutting, suturing, fighting death with needle and thread. Corporal Henderson arrived halfway through, still pulling on his shirt, his face creased with sleep and alarm. He stood in the doorway, watching, and Greta waited for him to order them to stop, to pull them away, to invoke whatever rules they were breaking. But he just watched, his jaw tight, until Dr. Vogel finally stepped back and said, "She'll live, if infection doesn't set in." Henderson exhaled slowly. "Y'all just performed surgery without authorization." "Yes," Dr. Vogel said simply. "Court-martial us if you must, but she would have died." For a long moment, Henderson said nothing. Then, "Commandant will want a report. Full details, in writing, by 0800. He paused at the door. "But for what it's worth, Doc, you did good, both of you." After he left, Greta stayed with Ruth through the night, monitoring her breathing, checking her pulse, changing the dressing on her incision. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring in German, sometimes in what sounded like Yiddish. At dawn, when her eyes finally opened clear and focused, she looked at Greta with something like wonder. "You saved me," Ruth whispered. "Dr. Vogel saved you. I just assisted." "No." Ruth's hand found Greta's, gripping with surprising strength. "You could have let me die. A Jew. You could have just let it happen. No one would have known." The words hung in the air between them, a gulf of history and horror that no amount of chicken and gravy could bridge. Because Ruth was right. Greta could have delayed, could have waited for Henderson, could have found a dozen small ways to ensure this woman died quietly in the night. And some part of her,
the part that had survived by following orders and not asking questions, recognized the temptation. I'm a nurse. That means something. It has to mean something. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Does it? After everything? Greta had no answer for that, but she held Ruth's hand until the woman fell back asleep, and she stayed at her bedside until Dr. Vogel arrived at 600 and ordered her to go eat breakfast. The commandant's response to the unauthorized surgery came that afternoon. Greta and Dr. Vogel were summoned to the administration building, where Commandant Morrison sat behind a desk covered with papers and coffee stains. His face was unreadable as he reviewed Dr. Vogel's report, his finger tracing the lines of careful German script. "You understand," he said in slow, deliberate German, "that you violated protocol, that surgery requires American medical oversight, that prisoners of war do not make decisions about emergency medical care without authorization." "Yes, sir," Dr. Vogel said. "We understand." "And you did it anyway." "The patient would have died, sir. There was no time." Morrison set down the report and looked at them both, his gray eyes moving from Dr. Vogel's defiant face to Greta's carefully neutral one. "The patient's name is Ruth Goldstein. She's not German military. She's a displaced person, a concentration camp survivor we picked up near Dachau. She was in the wrong place when the war ended, got caught up in a sweep of prisoners, and ended up here by mistake. We've been trying to sort out her paperwork for weeks." The room seemed to tilt. Greta felt something cold settle in her stomach. Ruth Goldstein, Dachau, concentration camp survivor. All the words she'd been avoiding, all the truths she'd been unable to face, suddenly crystallizing into one woman's suffering body on an operating table. "We didn't know," Greta heard herself say. Would it have mattered? Morrison's question wasn't accusatory, just genuinely curious. If you'd known she was Jewish, if you'd known she'd survived Dachau, would you have operated?
The honest answer terrified her. Because Greta didn't know. 2 years ago? 6 months ago? She'd like to think she would have done the same, but the truth was that 2 years ago, she'd been someone different. Someone who had followed orders and not asked too many questions. Someone who had looked away when it was convenient. "I don't know," she said, the words barely audible. "I don't know who I was then. But last night, I was a nurse, and she was a patient. And that was all that mattered." Morrison studied her for a long moment. "Miss Goldstein is being transferred to a DP camp in 2 weeks, when she's recovered enough to travel. You saved her life, Dr. Vogel, Nurse Hoffmann. Against regulations, yes, but you saved her life nonetheless." He pulled out 2 forms and began writing. "This is a commendation for your records. It won't mean much now, but when you go home, and you will go home eventually, it might mean something." They were dismissed. Walking back to the infirmary through the midday heat, Greta felt hollowed out, scraped clean. Dr. Vogel walked beside her in silence until they reached the door, then said quietly, "She asked, after you left this morning? Asked if we knew what she was. What did you tell her?" "The truth, that we didn't know, that it wouldn't have mattered, that a patient is a patient." Dr. Vogel's voice was rough. "I don't know if she believed me. I don't know if I believed me." Ruth recovered slowly. Each day brought a little more color to her cheeks, a little more strength to her movements. She didn't talk much about Dachau, about what had happened before the Americans came, but sometimes at night Greta would sit with her, and they would talk about other things. About food. Ruth had been a baker's daughter in Vienna before. About music. They'd both loved Schubert. About small, ordinary things that had existed in a world that seemed impossibly distant now. "The first thing I ate," Ruth said, one night, her voice soft in the darkened infirmary, "when the Americans liberated the camp. They gave us soup. Chicken soup. I threw it up within minutes. My stomach couldn't handle it. But I remember thinking, even as I was vomiting, that it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever tasted." Greta thought about the fried chicken, about her own first meal in the camp. "Chicken seems to be the Americans' solution to everything." Ruth laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Maybe it is. Maybe that's not the worst solution. She was quiet for a moment. You know what's strange? Being here with all of you. German women. Women who wore the uniform. And I keep thinking, were any of you there? At the camps? Did any of you know? The question was almost casual, but Greta heard the weight beneath it. I didn't know. Or I knew something, but I didn't know what it meant. We heard rumors, whispers, but I was at the front, in field hospitals, and we were busy with the wounded, and... She stopped. That's not good enough, is it? It doesn't matter that I was busy, or that I didn't see it myself. It happened, and I wore the uniform. Yes, it happened. They sat in silence. Then Greta understood that this was the real weight she would carry, heavier than any war wound. Not the things she'd done, but the things she'd failed to ask about, failed to see, failed to stop. The chicken and gravy couldn't erase that. The kindness of captors couldn't absolve it. Nothing could. But she could sit here in this moment and bear witness to one woman's survival. It wasn't redemption. She wasn't sure redemption was possible, but it was something. A beginning, perhaps, of learning to live with the weight. The letter writing began the following week. Greta sat in the barracks with a single sheet of paper and a pencil, trying to compress everything into the 100 words they were allowed. How could she explain Arkansas to her parents? How could she describe fried chicken and American guards and the strange mercy of being fed well by your enemy? In the end, she wrote simply, I am alive, I am safe, I am being treated well. Please write if you can. I love you. The letter went into the pile with 40 others, all heading to Germany through the Red Cross, all carrying the same desperate hope that someone on the other side was still alive to read them. Weeks would pass before any replies came, if they came at all. But the act of writing, of reaching across the ocean towards the possibility of home, felt like a small act of faith. As summer deepened into its full Arkansas fury, life in the camp settled into rhythms. Work details rotated, some in the laundry, others in the kitchens, still others in maintenance. The medical staff remained constant, treating the endless small ailments of 400 women adapting to a new climate, new food, new everything. Greta learned the names, learned the stories, or the parts of stories women were willing to tell. Each one carried her own weight, her own grief, her own guilt. And once a week, sometimes twice, there was fried chicken. It never stopped being extraordinary. The abundance never stopped being shocking. But gradually Greta learned to accept it, learned to eat without waiting for someone to snatch the plate away. The chicken became a strange kind of marker, a measure of time passing. Another week survived, another portion of crispy golden comfort in a world turned upside down. On a Saturday evening in August, Greta stood outside the infirmary, watching the sunset paint the sky in probable colors. Tomorrow, Ruth Goldstein would leave for the DP camp. Next week, 3 new medical staff would arrive from a camp in Texas. The war in the Pacific had ended with bombs so terrible that even the rumors were hard to believe. Life continued its strange, dislocated march forward. Marguerite found her there, handed her a biscuit saved from dinner. Thought you might be hungry. Greta took it, felt the still warm softness in her palm. Thank you. They stood together in companionable silence, 2 women who had been something else before, who were learning to be something new. The crickets started their evening song. Somewhere in the camp, someone was laughing. The smell of dinner, pot roast tonight, still lingered in the air. Do you think, Marguerite said slowly, that we'll ever make sense of this? Any of this? Greta thought about Ruth Goldstein, about fried chicken, about the kindness of enemies and the cruelty of supposed protectors. She thought about the weight she carried, and the weight they all carried, the impossibility of redemption and the necessity of trying anyway. No, she said finally, I don't think it will ever make sense, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is just this, being alive, being here, taking the next step, and eating chicken when they give it to us? And eating chicken when they give it to us. The sky faded from orange to purple to deep blue. Stars appeared. The same stars that shone over Germany, over the rubble of Berlin, over the graves of everyone who hadn't survived. But they were also the stars over Arkansas, over this strange camp where enemies became something more complicated, where the future remained uncertain but possible. Greta bit into the biscuit, tasted butter and salt, and the yeasty warmth of bread made with care. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even understanding, but it was sustenance, and for now, for this moment, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own questions without answers. But tonight, she was alive and fed and standing under an Arkansas sky with a friend beside her. In a world that had been torn apart, those small things had to be enough to build on. They had to be.
Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel.